Sometimes when we do Bible studies, we go through a portion of the scriptures that either don't make sense or don't relate to us. But when you're digging for gold, sometimes you dig deep. Other times you just look on the surface to see if there are any nuggets of truth that you can apply to your life. And today we're going to see nuggets that will speak to our hearts and hopefully that you can apply to your life. And we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. If this is a blessing to you, I want you to think about helping us make more of these kind of videos. Go to the little heart down below and hit on that, and you can buy us a cup of coffee, and that'll all help go to making more of these videos. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are going to continue our study in First Chronicles. And we're going to do 2 chapters today. And this is an example of when we don't understand what's going on and it doesn't really apply to us, how we can go through these verses looking for nuggets of truth that will apply to our lives, that will make us think about what's going on in not only these chapters, but also what's going on in us. And we're going to get into that right now. Now, we're going to be in chapter 24 and 25 today, and we're going to see this section in First Chronicles on the organization of the temple. Now, you and I, Kyle, have done a number of studies up to this point in First Chronicles, all these chapters, and we've talked about the temple and the priests a number of times.
Yeah.
And it seems, is this just a rehashing of that? But if we go back and look carefully at these, we'll see there is a difference each time it talks about this. The first time it talks about people who had to prove to be related to the Levites. That was about heritage and proving where you belonged, kind of thing. The next time we see it discussed is the role of priests and their functions. We saw that with different types of serving the gatekeepers and the priests and the musicians and all that. But this time is a little different because this time the chronicler is taking it from the aspect of how do you decide of the Levites who does what? So now this is the details of organizing these families into certain functions in the temple services. So it's a little bit different, and we're going to see some interesting things about that as we go here in chapter 24 and chapter 25. You ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right. I'm going to ask some questions that kind of get us going, and we're going to notice a few nuggets as we go here, and we're going to skip through a lot of these names. You can read these names, but you don't have to get into the weeds of trying to figure out who is who and go back and research all the names unless you want to. But we're going to look for little interesting nuggets of truth. Now, the first thing in chapter 24 is it establishes what it's talking about. Let's look at the last verse of chapter 23. It says, "Thus they are to keep charge of the tent." This is talking about their functions, "of the sons of Aaron, their relatives, for the service of the house of the Lord." That launches us into a discussion of the descendants of Aaron as pertain to that little phrase, the service of the house of the Lord, okay?
Okay.
So we can watch that. Now, it starts with verse 1. Now the divisions of the descendants of Aaron were, and it starts to name these guys. Then it goes on and is talking about these descendants of Aaron. Remember when we talked about in the story of David, the chronicler doesn't talk about the sin with Bathsheba?
Right.
And here in the sons of Aaron, we're going to see 2 of the sons, Nadab and Abihu. It says in verse 2, they died before their father and had no sons. Now, the chronicler just omits, he just not covering it, same way he didn't do it with David. This is the story in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 2, where Nadab and Abihu were judged by God and killed for offering strange fire. In other words, for not serving correctly as priests. And that's just, it's mentioned because they died, and the Jews would have known that story. It was fairly renowned for the story of two sons went astray, and two of them, Azar and Ithamar, were okay. And I underline again, this purpose of this chapter is Azar and Ithamar served as priests. So this service as priests is important in this chapter. And we're going along now. The first section, it talks about the descendants of Eleazar, and then it's going to talk about the descendants of Ithamar and just how they served as priests. And again, verse 3, David divided them according to their offices for their ministry. So the emphasis again is on the specific ministry of these priests. Now, I want you to notice one other thing, and that is in this verse, we're going to see this a number of times. In verse 3, it talks about David basically organized the priests, right?
Yeah.
But if you read that verse, and I want you to read it, and we're going to look and ask the question, did David just arbitrarily on his own make the decision of who's going to go where and how the organization would be? I want you to read verse 3.
David with Zadok of the sons of Eleazar and Ahimelech of the sons of Ithamar divided them according to their offices for their ministry.
Okay, so if we ask the question, did David just decide who was going to serve where?
It says with Zadok, so there's someone else involved in making the decision.
So David had a group of people, Zadok and others, that gave him input into this structure. So we don't want to think of David as just deciding. Now remember, David has retired. Solomon is now the king, but David is focusing on the temple, not the building of the temple, because God told him he couldn't do that, but he's focusing on the structure of the temple in these chapters.
Okay.
But he's not doing it just arbitrarily on his own. And we're going to see that a number of times as we go here. And I just wanted to point that out, that when it came to an important decision, David made that decision with good counsel from people. Okay?
Okay.
Now, if we go back, let's look at some more verses here just very quickly. We jump down, we see that the descendants of Eleazar and Ithamar, you see that in verse 5, thus they were divided by lot. I wanted to stop here. They are divided by lot in order to be officers of the sanctuary, officers of God. That's not an and as in there were some that were officers of the sanctuary and others were officers of God. It was the fact that officers of the sanctuary functioned as officers of God, not civil officials. So these are not government officers. These are spiritual officers. Now, there's a little phrase in that verse that goes to, once David got the divisions down, how were they decided who was going to do what? What does verse 5 say?
Divided by lot.
What's your reaction to the idea that they divided them by lot?
Reminds me of the story of, is it in Jonah where they do lots to determine that it was Jonah who was the problem?
Okay, that's one. Yeah.
I know there are other passages as well.
We see the Roman soldiers dividing Christ's garments by lot. There was an interesting thing that there's a difference between what we see in Jonah and what we're going to see. I'm going to share some cross references here. We today in the culture treat the casting of lots the same way the Roman soldiers did. And that was, it's going to be up to luck. We're going to throw the dice and whoever is lucky wins, right?
Yeah.
But in the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we see that the Jews used casting of lots as a way of determining God's will. When you had some options and you prayed about it and these options laid out before you, and all of them looked like good options, it was perfectly acceptable to say, we're going to let God decide. And we're going to cast lots in order to let God decide the decision, not luck, God.
Okay.
I want to show you some examples of this. I want you to be ready to flip around here some. I did a little Bible study on this idea of they divided by lot. And I said, why are they doing it by lot? And I want you to notice that in chapter 24, verse 31, 25, verse 8, and 26, verse 13, it talks about the Jews using lots to determine what God wants. So I want you to turn to Joshua.
Okay.
This is when he's going into the land, okay? And I want you to look up verse 6 of Joshua 18.
Okay. And you shall write a description of the land in 7 divisions, and bring the description here to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord our God.
So this is Joshua's going to help them decide who's going to go where in the land. Now look at verse 8.
Then the men arose and went, and Joshua commanded those who went to write a description of the land, saying, Go and walk through the land and write a description of it, and return to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh.
Now read verse 10.
Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord, and there Joshua divided the land for the sons of Israel according to their divisions.
Now you notice that Joshua casts lots before the Lord. That's this idea of being prayerful and saying, I'm going to cast lot and let the Lord decide. It isn't gambling. It's trusting that God is in charge and God is sovereign enough to guide his people through that mechanism.
Yeah.
You had a situation in your life where you pray about something and you could go in 3 different directions. I think it's perfectly biblical to cast lots to see where does God want me to go, and doing it before the Lord prayerfully. I want you to look at one other. This is kind of overlooked. I want you to look up in Luke, go to chapter 1, verse 9.
I think it's talking about Zechariah here. It says, according to the custom of the priestly office, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense.
Yeah, now this is John the Baptist's father. Now, an interesting thing there, it dawned on me, John the Baptist was a Levite. Before he was a Nazarene, he was the son of a high priest.
Yeah.
It never really dawned on me before. But here we have a case where Zechariah, who's going to go in and he's going to hear the prophecy about you're going to have a son born that's going to be a claimer of the coming Messiah, that the way he was chosen to go in that particular moment in history was by lot.
Yeah.
And it was a tradition of the priests that the way they chose, there were a number of priests of the line of Aaron who could have served as high priests for that period of time, but the one who was chosen to go into the Holy of Holies and intercede for the people was chosen by lot. So this wasn't gambling. This was letting God decide.
Okay.
All right. So it's just a little interesting nugget that we see here that a number of times David instructs the people to organize, and the specific organization under that was determined by lot. I found that to be interesting and sometimes a good application for us. So there again in verse 5, this idea of officers of the sanctuary, officers of God to serve, right?
Yep.
And then again in verse 6, David is recording these. Shimei is the scribe that records these official structure, and he records that in the presence of the king David and the princes and Zodach and Ahimelech and the son of Abithar, Ahimelech, who is the son of Abiathar, and the heads of the priests and the households of the priests. So again, David is not setting this structure by himself. He's got counsel here. You see that?
Yeah.
And I think that can apply to us. Now, the lot divides the people into sections. And in verse 10 is just an interesting thing. The 8th section was Abihar, and John the Baptist's father is a descendant of Abihar.
Okay.
It's interesting. That's recorded in Luke chapter 1, verse 5, that he is a descendant of the group of priests that were descended from Abihar. Okay, now that goes in. All these names is interesting. I want you to read verse 19.
These were their offices for their ministry when they came into the house of the Lord according to the ordinance given to them through Aaron their father, just as the Lord God of Israel had commanded him.
So then again, here's the offices for ministry. So this is different than trying to decide who's related to who. This is different than decide what the actual duties are. This is deciding who is going to do the specific duties. Then it starts in verse 20 with the rest of the sons. So up until verse 20, it's all been the sons of Aaron. And now we're talking about the rest of the sons of Levi. Okay. And we got the Kohathites and we have the Merarites in 26 on. Then we go on to the rest of the chapter, reinforcing verse 31 that they used lots, just as their relatives, the sons of Aaron, in the presence of God had done. So this idea of casting lots to determine where God wanted people to go was very traditional in the Jewish culture. And it's interesting also that at no place does God say, don't cast lots. That's gambling. No, it was perfectly acceptable for them to pray about the decisions that needed to be made and let God choose.
Okay.
So that's very typical there. Now we're going to go into 25, and 25 is the structure of the choir and the ministry, the music ministry. And I want us to notice one thing. Read verse 1 of chapter 25.
Okay. Moreover, David and the commanders of the army set apart for the service some of the sons of Asaph and of Heman and of Jeduthun, who were to prophesy with lyres, harps, and cymbals. And the number of those who performed their service was.
Okay, so this again is talking about the specific service of some descendants. Now, one of the things that I wanted to look at that's interesting is David is making a decision again with help. And who's the help?
The commanders of the army?
Yeah. Now, they're going to decide on musicians.
Yeah.
Why would the commanders of the army help David in choosing musicians?
Is there maybe a military component of the musicians and the service they do?
What do you think of that? Where was a military component of music? Do you
I
remember?
know in Joshua, the conquest of Canaan, they would play as they marched around Jericho, for instance.
Jericho, for example, they marched around with the army, but in front of the army, there was a band.
Yeah.
So in Israel, it was very much a part of military campaigns to have music as part of the campaigns. So it's interesting that David says, we're going to have musicians serving in the temple, but the musicians need to be able to do a tune that inspires the army. So I'm going to have some of the army help in the picking them. It's just an interesting little thing.
Yeah.
One other thing interesting about this, if we look at that verse, it says that the army set apart for service some of the sons of Asaph. Now we know Asaph from the name in the book of Psalms. Asaph was the choir director who wrote a bunch of psalms. And so these are the sons of Asaph, the choir director, and of two other guys. And then it says, and these musicians were to prophesy with lyres and harps and cymbals, and a number of those who performed their service was, and then it goes into this list. Now in verse 2, it talks about this list, and it gives again, who prophesied under the direction of the king. And in verse 3, it talks about these guys who prophesied in giving thanks and praising the Lord.
Okay.
So what do you think of when you read that verse, that these musicians prophesied?
I'm not sure.
Read that and we go, that's kind of weird. I wonder what that means. And we look up the word prophesied in the Hebrew. And in the Hebrew, it basically means to foretell. And when you and I think of prophecy, we think of telling the future. And there were prophets who told the future, but not necessarily all the time about the future. Sometimes it was just foretelling what God wanted. So there's prophecy of telling the future. There's also a foretelling of God's desire, God's will in your life. And as part of worship, the idea of worship, the band should prophesy and that it should be foretelling what God wants. Now, this would be the equivalent of a worship band that did secular songs or just played music for the sake of music, and there was no desire to communicate a focus on God. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. You're saying that's the opposite of foretelling?
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea of the worship music needed to be inspiring for the military, yes, but it also needed to be focused on foretelling what God wanted for his people. And that was going to become very important in the temple services.
Okay.
The music wasn't just designed to be like background music in Starbucks.
Mm-hmm.
The music was supposed to be designed to foretell what God wanted for his people. So the words needed to be words that communicated what God wanted in worship. You see what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Now, it's just an interesting idea that in the plan David had all along was the idea that the band was going to serve in forthtelling God's desires for the people. Now, if we go down here again, we see the singing and the service in verse 6. All these musicians were under the direction of their father to sing in the house of the Lord with cymbals and harps and lyres, with the service of the house of God. I've known denominations that say there shouldn't be music with singing. We should just sing. But here clearly in the scriptures, we see singing accompanied by a band. We talked about that over in chapter 6. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of this video. But verse 7 says there were a number trained in singing to the Lord with their relatives. And it was 288. Now, if you take the number 288, and he divides it up here, if you look from verse 9 down to the end, there are 24 divisions of 12 guys each division.
Okay.
So if let's say you had, like in our particular church, we have 3 services. You might have 5 services on a Sunday. It's not necessarily the same worship band who's got to do all 5 services or all 3 services. There can be teams, and that's what David's doing. And there's going to be 24 teams, 12 guys each team. That makes 288 people.
Okay.
Just an interesting structure in the temple worship of not only the priests and their activities. We saw last week the priests from 30 years old and older, and then priests from 20 years old and older who were to be the assistants. Here, now we're going to talk about the priests of Aaron serve as high priests. The other Levites just serve in the temple. And then there's going to be a choir and a band that serve in the temple.
Okay.
So here again, we see this discussion. Is a worship band biblical? We see here, and we're going to talk about, in fact, I'm going to leave a link at the end of this video, all the way back in chapter 6, where David very specifically lays out the worship band.
Yeah, I remember that.
So we've seen the structure of the service. We saw the structure of the heritage, and we saw the structure of just the serving, the various aspects. And now we're seeing who is going to do what in the temple. Very important for the Jews who are coming out of the captivity to go back to do the temple. And we see that in the motivation of the writer of First Chronicles, who I think was Ezra. We didn't get bogged down in all these names. We looked for what is it about these names? Are there any blessings for us in that? And we saw some, I hope, some significant blessings for us in these little details that we see in these chapters. Well, today we've been talking about the structure of the Levites for the sake of service. I want to recommend a couple of videos to you. First of all, a video in First Chronicles that talks about, is the worship band biblical? And this goes for all the way back to chapter 6. I think you'll enjoy it, and it'll tie in with this chapter talking about the service of worship. And then the other video I want to recommend is a video called A Reality Check on Our Worship. It's out of the book of Malachi, and I recommend it strongly, and I hope you'd like it. And if you do, be sure to hit the like button. And we're going to continue our study next week. And until then, God bless you.